I didn't know my life was about to split cleanly in two until I held a single letter in my hands and realized that everything I thought was true about myself was built on a lie. Just 3 months earlier, I had been living in a $4.2 million house in the hills of California, watching the city lights glitter below my windows like spilled diamonds. I had a husband, 2 teenage children, and a life that, at least from the outside, looked untouchable, stable, finished. The kind of life people point to and say, "She made it." Now I was sitting alone in a quiet house in Ohio, surrounded by dust, memories, and the faint scent of lavender soap and old books. My mother's house. The house she left behind when she died. The one place in the world I thought was still safe. I'm Daniela Carter, and I'm 47 years old. Until recently, I worked as a commercial insurance adjuster in Pasadena. I spent my days walking through other people's disasters, fires, floods, collapsed businesses, carefully documenting the damage and helping them rebuild. I believed in facts, in evidence, in the idea that the truth, once uncovered, could set things right. What I didn't know was that my own life was quietly being dismantled from the inside. 18 months ago, my marriage began to rot in ways I couldn't explain. My husband, Andrew, grew distant, cold, calculated. The warmth we'd shared for nearly 2 decades faded so slowly that I kept telling myself I was imagining it. Work stress, midlife exhaustion, a phase. Then came the divorce papers. Not a separation, not a conversation, a legal annihilation. According to those documents, I wasn't the woman I knew myself to be. I was accused of hiding massive gambling debts, of stealing money, of being financially unstable and psychologically unfit to raise my own children. They had bank statements I'd never seen, casino records from places I'd never been, witnesses, people I knew, claiming I'd spiraled out of control, and the court believed them. In 6 weeks, I lost my house, my career, my reputation, and my children. What I didn't understand, what nearly broke me, was why. Why would the man I loved since my teenage years destroy me so completely? Why did the evidence against me feel too perfect, too thorough, too coordinated? And why, after everything was taken from me, did my life funnel me back to this exact house, to a hidden safe, and to a letter my mother never meant me to read unless it was absolutely necessary? Because the woman who destroyed my life may not have been my enemy at all, and the mother I thought I knew may have saved me without ever telling me the truth. Before everything collapsed, my life felt carefully assembled, like something built slowly, deliberately, with patience and faith. I was born and raised believing my name was Daniela Carter, the only child of Eleanor Carter, a quiet librarian in a small Ohio town. My father, I was told, had died in a car accident when I was 12, a tragedy that arrived suddenly and left no space for questions. My mother never spoke much about him. I learned early not to ask. We didn't have much money, but we never felt poor. My mother had a way of making scarcity feel intentional. She clipped coupons with precision, kept envelopes for bills neatly labeled, and somehow always knew exactly how much we could afford. Never $1 more, never $1 less. She packed my lunches every morning, walked to work carrying a brown paper bag of her own, and came home each evening with books tucked under her arm like quiet companions. She was steady, predictable, safe. That steadiness shaped me. I became someone who valued structure, routine, and reliability. I studied hard. I went to college. I built a career in commercial insurance, an industry rooted in proof, documentation, and accountability. I learned how to stay calm while others panicked, how to walk into chaos and leave with clarity. I met Andrew when I was 17 and he was 16. High school sweethearts. The kind people assume won't last, but somehow do. He was charming, ambitious, magnetic in a way that drew people toward him without effort. Where I was observant and grounded, he was bold and aspirational. Together, we felt balanced. We married young. We grew up together. We made mistakes, learned from them, and kept going. After college, Andrew went into real estate. I stayed in insurance. His career flourished quickly. Long hours, bigger deals, expanding networks. Mine grew steadily, predictably. When opportunities opened in California, we took the leap together, moving west with nothing but ambition and faith in what we'd built. The house came years later, the one in the hills, the one people gasped at when they visited for the first time. Then came our children. Ryan, our eldest, tall and athletic, already carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to expectations. Maya, younger, introspective, endlessly creative. She saw the world differently, through color, shadow, and emotion, and often noticed things the rest of us missed. They became the center of my gravity. For years, our life worked. Busy, yes. Stressful, sometimes. But functional, loving, familiar. I believed in our marriage the way I believed in gravity, something constant you didn't question because it had always been there. Looking back now, I can see the hairline fractures. Andrew's family was polite but distant, always evaluating, always subtly reminding me of expectations I was meant to meet but never fully named. I absorbed their judgments quietly, convinced that being patient and accommodating was part of being a good wife. When Andrew worked late, I believed him. When he took calls outside, I didn't pry. When he grew distracted, I told myself marriage had seasons. I trusted him. That trust wasn't blind. It was earned over years of shared history, shared children, shared sacrifice. Which is why, when the ground finally gave way beneath me, it felt less like falling, and more like realizing the floor had been hollow the entire time. The unraveling didn't begin with a single explosion. It began with silence. Andrew started taking phone calls in other rooms. At first, it was subtle, his voice dropping, his body angling away from me, his hand covering the screen when I walked past. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a familiar house. Not alarming, just off. He came home later, always with a reason. A client dinner, a last-minute showing, a deal that couldn't wait. I wanted to believe him, and so I did. Belief, I learned later, can be an act of self-preservation as much as denial. But something else changed, too, the way he looked at me. For years, Andrew had looked at me with familiarity, comfort, affection, shared history. Now there was distance in his eyes, like he was studying me instead of seeing me, measuring, reassessing, as if I were a stranger who'd wandered into his life by mistake. I tried to talk to him. "Is something wrong?" I asked one night, while he scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. He shrugged. "Work's just intense right now." I planned date nights, cooked meals he used to love, suggested weekends away. Each attempt seemed to push him further back, as though my efforts themselves were an inconvenience. The warmth between us cooled slowly, painfully, until I felt like I was living beside someone who merely tolerated me. The children noticed before I admitted it to myself. Ryan started asking careful questions. "Why does Dad seem mad all the time?" Maya retreated into her room, sketchbook always in hand. Her drawings changed. Families with forced smiles, figures standing close but never touching, cracks in walls that no one else seemed to see. I told myself it was stress, that Andrew's career was demanding more of him, that marriage required endurance. Then his family began to insert themselves. His mother called more often, her tone laced with concern that felt rehearsed. "You seem tired lately, Daniela. Are you taking care of yourself?" His sister asked questions about our finances that made no sense. "Andrew says things are tight. Is everything okay?" That was the first time I felt a flicker of real unease. Things weren't tight. I knew our finances down to the cent. I handled our household budgeting meticulously, the way my mother had taught me. There were no missing funds, no unexplained withdrawals. When I asked Andrew about it, he brushed me off. "I didn't say that. You must have misunderstood." But the atmosphere shifted. Conversations felt scripted. Glances were exchanged when I wasn't meant to notice. Andrew began correcting me in front of others. Small things, but always with a subtle edge, as though he were establishing a narrative I wasn't aware of yet. I started doubting myself. Was I missing something? Forgetting things? Had I been too focused on work? Too confident in my version of reality? At night, lying beside him, I replayed conversations in my head, searching for signs I might have overlooked. My body sensed danger long before my mind accepted it. My sleep grew shallow. My chest felt tight more often than not. Still, I held on. 18 years of marriage doesn't dissolve easily. You don't assume betrayal. You assume misunderstanding. I told myself we just needed time. I didn't know that while I was trying to save my marriage, someone else was carefully planting the seeds of my destruction. And by the time I realized what was happening, the story of who I was had already begun to change, without my consent. The divorce papers arrived on an ordinary morning. That was the cruelest part. I was following the same routine I'd had for years. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, the low hum of the dishwasher, the familiar rhythm of a life I still believed was intact. I was adjusting my blazer in the mirror, preparing for a day of client inspections, when the doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. I remember checking the clock because the time felt wrong. When I opened the door, a man stood there holding a thick envelope. Neutral expression, professional posture. The kind of person trained not to react to emotion. "Daniela Carter?" "Yes." "You've been served." The words didn't register at first, not fully. I closed the door, set the envelope on the kitchen counter, and just stared at it for several seconds, as though it might explain itself if I waited long enough. Then I opened it. It wasn't a request for divorce. It was a declaration of war. According to the petition, I was a compulsive gambling addict, a woman who had secretly accumulated massive debts, siphoned money from family accounts, and endangered my children's financial and emotional stability. Andrew was requesting full custody, sole ownership of the house, my retirement accounts, and even a claim against my professional assets. My hands started shaking so violently I had to sit down. There were bank statements I'd never seen before, withdrawals from accounts I didn't recognize, casino receipts with my signature from cities I'd never visited, credit card charges tied to online gambling platforms I had never heard of. It was thorough, detailed, terrifyingly convincing. That evening, I found Andrew in our bedroom, folding clothes into boxes with mechanical precision. "Andrew," I said, holding the papers out in front of me, my voice breaking despite my effort to control it. "What is this?" He didn't look up. "Read it," he replied calmly. I did, and none of it is true. He paused then, just for a moment. Slowly, deliberately, he placed a shirt into a box and finally turned to face me. "The evidence says otherwise." "What evidence?" I demanded. "Show me the accounts. Show me the statements. You know I don't gamble. You know me." That was when I saw it. Not anger, not hurt, something colder. "You're not the woman I married," he said quietly. "Maybe you never were." The words landed like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't an argument. This was a verdict already reached. Over the next 6 weeks, my life became a blur of legal offices, document reviews, and disbelief. Andrew's lawyer presented the case with ruthless efficiency. Financial records, witness statements, expert opinions describing patterns of hidden addiction and long-term deception. People I barely recognized claimed they had lent me money. A neighbor I'd shared casual conversations with signed an affidavit describing me as erratic and unstable. Even my own attorney hesitated. "Daniela," he said gently one afternoon, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, "I need to ask you something. If any of this is true, if there's even a small part you haven't told me, we need to know now." I looked him straight in the eye. "I swear on my children's lives," I said, "I have never gambled. I have never stolen. Someone is fabricating this, and I don't know how." The custody evaluation was humiliating. A court-appointed psychologist asked me questions as if the accusations were already facts. My answers felt thin against the mountain of documentation stacked neatly in front of her. "Denial is common," she said gently, pen moving across her notepad. "Many addicts don't recognize the extent of their behavior." "I'm not in denial," I replied, my voice shaking despite myself. "I'm telling the truth." The courtroom was worse. I sat there day after day listening as strangers dismantled my identity piece by piece. Andrew's lawyer spoke about me like I wasn't in the room, like I was a case study, a cautionary tale. When the judge finally ruled, my vision blurred. Andrew was awarded the house, primary custody, control over assets. I was granted supervised visitation every other weekend, pending completion of gambling treatment and financial counseling. It felt like my chest cracked open. Outside the courthouse, Andrew approached me with a smile I had never seen before. Cold, satisfied. He leaned in close and whispered, "You'll never see the kids again. I'm moving them to Portland next month." This wasn't a marriage ending. This was my life being deliberately erased. And it's quiet, heavy, disorienting. In the days after the ruling, I moved through my life like a ghost, haunting someone else's body. I packed a single suitcase under Andrew's watchful silence. I hugged my children goodbye in the driveway of the house that was no longer mine, careful not to cry too hard, terrified that any show of emotion might be recorded, documented, weaponized against me later. Ryan barely looked at me. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking, "did you really do those things?" I knelt in front of her, pressing my forehead to hers, breathing her in like oxygen. "No," I said softly, "never. And one day you'll know that for sure." But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me. Not doubt in my innocence, but doubt in reality itself. Because if evidence said I was guilty, if the court believed it, if my own husband believed it, then how did truth survive in a world like this? The apartment I moved into was small, bare, temporary in every way that mattered. A place chosen not because it felt like home, but because it was all I could afford. The silence there was oppressive. No footsteps overhead, no teenage music bleeding through walls, no familiar sounds of shared life. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation from the last 2 years. Had I trusted too easily? Was there a moment, just one, where I could have stopped this? I blamed myself in 100 quiet ways for not pushing harder when Andrew pulled away, for believing explanations instead of patterns, for assuming love meant safety. And then there was the fear that my children would grow up believing a lie about their mother, fear that supervised visitation would turn into nothing at all, fear that I would fade from their lives, slowly, legally, irreversibly. The lowest point came the day my insurance license was suspended. A formal letter, polite language, professional condemnation, pending investigation into financial misconduct. I sat at the tiny kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands, and felt something inside me finally give way. I had built my entire identity around integrity, around evidence, around trust. And now, on paper, I was none of those things. That night, I cried until my chest hurt, until my eyes burned, until there was nothing left inside me but exhaustion. And then something shifted. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was my mother's voice echoing from somewhere deep inside me, reminding me that problems didn't solve themselves by collapsing under their weight. Whatever it was, I realized one undeniable truth. If I stayed where I was, I would disappear. I had no money, no career, no credibility. There was only one place left that no one could take from me: my mother's house in Ohio, the house that had been sitting empty since her death 2 years earlier, the house Andrew's lawyers hadn't touched because it wasn't part of our marital assets. I packed what little I had left into my car: documents, clothes, fragments of a life that used to be whole, and began the drive east. 3 days on the road, 3 days of empty highways and cheap motels. Every mile felt like I was traveling backward in time, away from the woman I'd become and toward the girl I used to be. When I finally pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, the house looked exactly as it had the day of my mother's funeral. Small, neat, unassuming, white siding, black shutters, a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table where she used to sit every evening with her tea and a book. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me instantly. Lavender soap, old paper, books, home. I stood there in the quiet, surrounded by the life my mother had built for us, and let myself breathe for the first time in months. I had lost almost everything, but this house, this one solid thing, was still mine. And standing there, with nothing left to lose, I made a decision. I would fight, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth, whatever it turned out to be. I had no idea yet that the truth waiting for me in that house would change everything. The first weeks in my mother's house were heavier than I expected. Grief layered itself over exhaustion. Some mornings I couldn't bring myself to shower. I lay on the couch staring at a faint water stain on the ceiling, tracing its shape with my eyes like it might tell me how my life had become so unrecognizable in less than a year. I thought about Ryan and Maya constantly. Were they angry with me? Confused? Did they believe Andrew's version of the story? That their mother was reckless, unstable, dangerous? I imagined Andrew filling the silence with carefully chosen words. Words that sounded reasonable. Words that painted him as the protector and me as the threat. That thought hurt more than the loss of the house, more than the career, more than my reputation. After about a month, the sadness curdled into something sharper. Resolve. I couldn't afford despair, not if I wanted my children back. The house itself became my focus. My mother had kept it livable, but time had taken its toll. Cabinets sagged, paint peeled. The bathroom fixtures belonged to another era. If I was going to sell it for enough money to fund a real legal fight, it had to shine. So I worked. I stripped wallpaper until my fingers blistered, sanded floors until my arms shook, painted walls late into the night, music echoing through empty rooms. Physical labor grounded me. Each stroke of paint felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. The basement was the last space I tackled. It was cluttered with decades of storage, boxes labeled in my mother's careful handwriting, holiday decorations, old photo albums, my elementary school projects she'd never thrown away. Going through her things was both painful and comforting. Every object carried memory. Every box reminded me who I came from. That was when I noticed something strange. The furnace. It sat in the corner where it always had, but the concrete around it looked wrong, scratched, disturbed. Dust settled in unnatural patterns, as if the furnace had been moved recently. That made no sense. My mother had been frail in her later years. She could barely lift grocery bags, let alone shift a piece of equipment weighing hundreds of pounds. I knelt down, running my fingers along the concrete. The marks were real, recent. My heart began to pound. I spent the rest of the afternoon figuring out how to move the furnace. Disconnecting the gas line terrified me, but fear felt familiar by then. With a dolly, leverage, and stubborn determination, I shifted it several feet from the wall. Behind it, set into the concrete, was a small safe, painted the same dull gray as the wall, about 18 inches square, old-fashioned, worn smooth at the edges, as if it had been opened many times over many years. I stared at it for a long time. Why had my mother never told me about this? The lock was a combination dial, numbers from 0 to 99, 10,000 possibilities. Impossible to brute force without a clue. Then memory struck me so suddenly I had to sit down. Every year, on my birthday, March 15th, my mother called me at exactly 7:23 a.m. Not earlier, not later. "This is the exact moment you were born," she always said. "I like honoring it." March 15th, 77. My hands trembled as I turned the dial. Right to 03. Left to 15. right to 77. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard the softest click. The door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was money. Stacks of cash, more than I had ever seen in one place. Old bills bound with yellowed rubber bands, newer ones crisp and untouched. I counted them slowly, breath shallow. $847,000. Beneath the money were documents, driver's licenses, all with my mother's photograph. Different names, different states, different dates. Isabella Reyes, Maria Santos, Catherine Walsh, Social Security cards, birth certificates, even a passport. My mother, quiet librarian, single parent, the safest person I had ever known, had lived under multiple identities for decades. At the bottom of the safe was an envelope, my name written on it. My real name, or at least the one I thought was real. I sat on the cold basement floor, legs weak, and opened it. The first line stole the air from my lungs. My dearest Daniela, if you're reading this, they've finally found you, and I'm no longer here to protect you. I couldn't breathe. The letter dismantled my entire understanding of my life. My father hadn't died in an accident. His name wasn't what I'd been told. He had been murdered. My mother hadn't been a widow scraping by. She had been a federal witness. We had been in witness protection. Ohio wasn't a fresh start. It was a hiding place. And the most devastating truth of all came near the end of the letter. Andrew has been working with people who have been looking for us for decades. The room spun. The lies, the divorce, the evidence, the financial ruin. None of it had been random. It had been engineered. And suddenly, everything, every accusation, every cold look, every perfectly timed collapse made horrifying sense. I don't remember standing up from the basement floor. One moment I was sitting there, my back against cold concrete, my mother's letter shaking in my hands. The next, I was upstairs, barefoot in the kitchen, staring at the sink as if it were something unfamiliar. My body moved on instinct while my mind lagged behind, struggling to catch up with the truth that had just detonated inside me. My entire life hadn't just fallen apart. It had been designed to fall apart. I reread the letter slowly, line by line, forcing myself not to skip ahead, not to rush past anything just because it hurt too much. My mother's handwriting was calm, precise, like she was explaining a complicated recipe instead of confessing to a lifetime spent hiding from men who had murdered my father. She wrote about running, about changing names, about testifying in front of a federal grand jury while holding a toddler on her hip and knowing that one wrong move could get us both killed. She wrote about watching me grow up and praying I would never have to know any of this. And then she wrote about Andrew, how private investigators she'd hired had traced his connections, how people had approached him through his real estate work, slowly, subtly, how they had fed him lies about me, fake documents, fake proof, fake concerns about my behavior, how the divorce wasn't just about money or custody. It was about breaking me, about forcing me back to Ohio, to this house, to this safe. I dropped the letter onto the table and pressed my palms flat against the wood, my breathing shallow and fast. The images came uninvited. Andrew standing in our bedroom, folding clothes without emotion, his calm voice telling me the evidence didn't lie. The cold smile outside the courthouse. I had thought he was cruel. I hadn't understood he was controlled. Or worse, convinced. The nausea hit hard and fast. I barely made it to the bathroom before my body betrayed me. I knelt on the tile floor, shaking, my hands gripping the edge of the tub as wave after wave of disbelief crashed over me. Had he known what he was really doing? Had he known who these people were? Or had he simply believed the story that best served him? The answer didn't matter. The damage was the same. I thought about my children, Ryan's guarded silence, Maya's frightened eyes, and the weight of it nearly crushed me. They had watched their mother unravel in court. They had listened to accusations no child should ever hear about a parent, all because of a war that started before I was born. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in my mother's living room, The letters spread out on the coffee table, surrounded by the quiet evidence of her life. Her reading glasses, her bookmarked mystery novel, the couch where she used to sit and tell me everything would be okay, even when she couldn't possibly know that for sure. For the first time since the divorce, I felt truly alone, not abandoned. Exposed, because now I knew something terrifying. There were people in the world who had been willing to dismantle my life, patiently, legally, surgically, without ever raising a weapon. And they weren't finished. The letter ended with a phone number. A U.S. Marshal, a man my mother trusted enough to leave me with. I stared at the number for a long time. Calling it meant crossing a line I could never uncross. It meant accepting that the life I thought I'd lived was over, and that the future would be built on truths far darker than I had ever imagined. It meant putting my children back into the orbit of something dangerous. And not calling meant surrender. It meant letting Andrew's story become the only story. Letting my children grow up believing a lie. Letting the people who murdered my father win without ever having to show their faces. I pressed my fingers into my temples, my heart beat loud in my ears. I can't do this, I whispered to the empty room. Then I heard my mother's voice. Not literally, but clearly enough it might as well have been. Problems don't solve themselves by wishing they'd go away. I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. This was the lowest point. The moment where there was no illusion left to hide behind. Only a choice. And whatever I chose next would decide whether my life ended here or finally began to make sense. I dialed the number before I could change my mind. The phone. Richardson, a man's voice answered, calm, controlled, like someone who had been waiting longer than he was willing to admit. My name is Daniela Carter, I said, my voice unsteady. But I think my real name might be Daniela Castellano. There was recognition. I've been waiting for this call since your mother passed, he said quietly. Where are you right now? In her house, in Ohio. I found the safe. Good, he replied. Don't touch anything else. Don't tell anyone what you found. And don't leave that house. I'll be there in 4 hours. The line went dead. 4 hours felt like 4 days. I paced the house, checking locks I'd never worried about before. Every passing car outside made my heart jump. Every unfamiliar sound felt loaded with meaning. For the first time in my life, paranoia didn't feel irrational. It felt necessary. When Marshal Raymond Richardson arrived, he didn't come alone. 2 federal agents followed him inside, their movements efficient, practiced. Richardson himself was in his early 60s, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that had seen too much and learned not to flinch. They spent hours photographing documents, cataloging evidence, asking detailed questions about my life in California, the divorce, Andrew's accusations, the financial records. This was textbook, Richardson said at one point, shaking his head. Clean, subtle, legal. That's how they operate now. He explained everything my mother had only hinted at. The people who murdered my father had evolved. They no longer relied on violence alone. They dismantled lives quietly, through finances, reputations, relationships. They turned loved ones into unwitting weapons. They found Andrew through his business connections, Richardson said, approached him as clients, fed him fabricated evidence, made him believe you were hiding things. I swallowed hard. So he didn't know? He didn't know who they really were, Richardson said carefully. He believed he was protecting his children. The truth landed painfully, but cleanly. Andrew hadn't been the mastermind. He had been manipulated. The next morning, Richardson delivered the final revelation. Andrew had been arrested in Portland, along with the men who had been shadowing him since he left California. Once confronted with the truth, the evidence, and the federal charges those men were facing, everything collapsed. He's cooperating, Richardson said. Fully. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers together. Relief didn't come immediately. What came was clarity. For the first time in months, the chaos aligned into a single, brutal truth. None of this had been about my worth, or my marriage, or my failure as a wife or mother. It had been about control. And now, the call to my children came later that day. Ryan sounded small, younger than I remembered. "Mom, is it true?" he asked. "Did Dad lie?" I took a breath. "Your father was lied to, just like everyone else." Maya's voice cracked when she spoke. "You didn't do anything bad, did you?" "No," I said firmly, "and I never would." That night, sitting alone in my mother's house, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear. Resolve. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. The truth, no matter how dark, was finally on my side. And for the first time since my life collapsed, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The truth didn't explode. It cascaded. Slow at first, almost polite, then unstoppable. Once federal charges were filed, the carefully constructed story about me collapsed in stages. The fake bank statements were dismantled by forensic accountants who traced their origins to shell companies and doctored ledgers. The casino records unraveled under scrutiny, timestamps that didn't match, locations I could prove I'd never been near. The witnesses who had sworn I'd borrowed money suddenly remembered details differently when faced with perjury charges. One by one, they recanted. What had felt like a mountain of evidence turned out to be a facade. Impressive from a distance, hollow up close. The court moved quickly after that. The judge, who had once spoken to me with cool detachment, now reviewed the new filings with visible gravity. The tone of the room changed. The narrative changed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't defending myself. I was being vindicated. My insurance license was reinstated with a formal letter of apology from the state board. The suspension was officially declared wrongful. It didn't erase the months of damage to my reputation, but it did something just as important. It restored my name. Andrew's world, meanwhile, imploded. His professional network evaporated almost overnight. Clients disappeared. Friends stopped returning calls. The same people who had nodded sympathetically while he described my instability now avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how easily they had believed the lie. His family turned inward, quiet, ashamed. I didn't celebrate it. Watching someone fall, even someone who helped destroy you, isn't satisfying the way people imagine. It's sobering, sad, final. When I saw Andrew again, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was in a small conference room during a mediated session focused solely on our children. He looked older, smaller. The confidence that once filled every room had drained out of him, replaced by something raw and unsettled. "I didn't know," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "I swear to you, Daniela, I thought I was protecting them." I believed him. Not because I owed him forgiveness, but because I no longer needed him to be the villain. "I know," I replied, "but believing lies still has consequences." We didn't talk about reconciliation. There was nothing left to reconcile. What we talked about were schedules, therapy, how to help Ryan and Maya rebuild trust in both of us, how to explain to them that adults can be wrong without turning that wrong into a permanent wound. The custody order was reversed, not with drama, not with triumph, with quiet efficiency. The day Ryan and Maya came back to me, they didn't run. They walked, slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might disappear if they moved too fast. Maya hugged me first, burying her face into my coat like she had on the day I left. "I knew you weren't lying," she whispered. Ryan followed, taller than I remembered, his arms awkward around my shoulders. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he said, voice tight. I held them both, breathing them in, grounding myself in the reality I had almost lost forever. We didn't move back into the old life. There was no going back to the house in the hills. No attempt to reconstruct something that had been built on silence and manipulation. I sold my mother's house. It was harder than I expected. Standing in the empty living room one last time, I touched the wall where she used to lean while reading, the window where evening light used to fall across her favorite chair. Letting it go felt like closing a chapter that had saved me more times than I could count. The money didn't make us rich. It made us stable. Enough for a modest home in California. Enough to rebuild college funds. enough to breathe. The criminal case moved forward without me having to chase it. Evidence spoke where I no longer needed to. Testimony followed. Charges stuck. I watched from a distance as the people who had orchestrated my destruction were finally forced into the light they had spent decades avoiding. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't need to. The truth did what it always does. Eventually, it returned to its source. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in ordinary moments I hadn't trusted myself to hope for anymore. Ryan back on the basketball court, moving with the confidence of someone who knew where he belonged. His coach told me colleges were still watching, carefully, respectfully, without pressure. Maya at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open, her colors brighter than they had been in months. Her drawing still showed storms, but now they ended with light. We went to therapy, all three of us, sometimes together, sometimes apart. We learned how to talk about what happened without turning it into a weapon or a wound. We learned that trust, once broken, doesn't return by force. It returns by consistency. Andrew and I learned how to co-parent without pretending we were something we weren't anymore. There was no bitterness left to fuel fights, just shared responsibility and the quiet understanding that love for our children mattered more than our pride. I returned to work, carefully, deliberately. My reputation didn't snap back overnight, but it healed the way bones do, slowly, with patience, stronger in the places that once fractured. Clients returned. Colleagues apologized. Some never spoke to me again. I let them go. Some bridges don't need rebuilding. I think about my mother every day, about the life she never got to live openly, about the courage it took to run, to testify, to raise a child while carrying secrets that could have destroyed us both. She saved me twice, once when I was 12 and once when I was 47, without ever asking for recognition. I never got the chance to thank her, but I honor her now by living honestly, by protecting my children fiercely, by refusing to let lies define who I am. The worst thing that ever happened to me, losing my family, my home, my identity, led me back to the truth of who I was always meant to be, stronger than I knew, wiser than I thought, and no longer afraid of the dark. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the collapse of your life isn't the end. It's the moment you finally see the foundation clearly enough to rebuild it right. And this time, I'm not running. I'm standing.